And we just had a great conversation last week, which we did not record, but
That could
which
be
I
the
kept.
only good conversation we
Yeah.
have all year. Dang.
Yeah, exactly. Dang it. Lightning in a bottle. I should just start recording all my conversations and hire a full-time editor.
And a
But
lawyer, and a lawyer maybe.
and maybe a lawyer,
If you
depending
can
on the
record
state
all
that
your
you're in.
conversations.
Yeah. Well, I'm so happy that you took the time to join me today. This is not a I don't know if I warned you, but this is a very unprofessional sort of affair. This
You got the right guy then. Unprofessional. I can do that.
Okay. Yeah. This is not a tight ship I'm running here. It is it's a very loose kind of, I don't know, we'll see if we end up capturing something valuable, you know. I'm sure that somewhere in there will be good stuff. But thank you so much for spending the time to troubleshoot with me for the last half hour
No worries.
and to talk to me about your experience in the design space. So just a quick introduction, if you would, for the audience, what you who you are, and what your role is in this space. Maybe this is a good time to also introduce your picture, but that's up to you.
Okay, yeah, we can bring the picture in a bit, I guess. So I'm Greg Galle, and I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Solve Next, and we it's kind of a little bit elusive in terms of how we describe ourselves. But if I was going to boil it down, where we finally have landed for the moment is that we help organizations stand up disciplined systems of innovation. And that really was born out of the work that we did in conceiving of and developing what probably a next generation of design thinking called Think Wrong, very closely related cousins. So there's lots of overlaps. My background is as a designer. So I was trained as a designer. So I learned the basic problem-solving methodology that all designers are taught, regardless of if you're an industrial designer or a fashion designer or a communication designer, which was my area of focus. We all kind of get the same foundation, and we all learn this problem-solving methodology, which has a lot to do with sort of looking at the problem from this perspective of the user and trying to be empathetic and trying to get to a better outcome. And using making and modeling and visual exploration as part of the problem-solving approach. So that's my background. Think Wrong is really it's slightly more. I would say it's a complementary to design thinking. As I said, there's some consistencies, consistent things in that are the same, and then there's some things that are actually quite different. But it's born out of the practical experience that I have had for the many years that I've been doing this work and trying to help my peers and my clients solve problems using design techniques, using design approaches, and we got to a point, I think, where that work was going quite well, and our clients for about 5 years have been saying to us, "This is great. We love it. We love Think Wrong. It's really a powerful tool." They would say it's a powerful tool for ideation, a word I don't particularly care for, but they would say this is great. We're coming up with ideas that we've never come up with before. But our problem really isn't that we have a lack of ideas. It's so we don't know how to get our ideas from being a hypothesis all the way through to a solution that's working and operating in the world. Yeah. And so they told us that for about 5 years, they kept saying, "So, okay, this is great. What's next?" And we kept saying, "Well, you need to take the idea and make it real." And they said, "That's not sufficient. We need help." Yeah. So we've spent the last few years really working on from the perspective of Solve Next. In fact, we changed our name. Our name used to be Future, and we changed the name to Solve Next because of this question that people are asking of what's next. It's okay. Well, how are we going to solve that? How are we going to actually do that work? And that's where how we've moved from a problem-solving methodology that is very powerful for idea generation to how to use that problem-solving methodology and generate ideas that are disruptive all the way through the development cycle, from strategy making to we have a hypothesis about a problem or a pain that exists that we could do something about, to we have a solution hypothesis, to we're testing assumptions, to we're actually building something and learning from doing it for real, to we're now handing that thing over to the organization that's going to run and operate it, and how do we do that effectively? So it's really trying to go all the way through. So that's a long answer to who I am, but that's the nature of the business that we're in. We also like to say that we are problem and sector agnostic. So we're not deep experts in a particular industry or sector. It's not like, oh, well, we only work with the Air Force because, we know everything that there is to know about X, Y, and Z. We're expert in how to get human beings to let go of assumptions and orthodoxies and biases that hold them back, how to trick their brains and culture into considering new possibilities, and in how to use frameworks to organize both our thinking and our action to get to outcomes. And that's really where we spend our time and our energy. And that gives us the unique opportunity to explore all sorts of different problem spaces with all sorts of different people. That's part of one of the things we really like about the work we do.
Just one thing that you kind of mentioned about think wrong, that kind of rings especially true to me is that I think so. I started just learning about human-centered design, from the National Security Innovation Network. I think they were MD5 at the time, and I saw a huge amount of potential in it, but I didn't exactly understand why I like why this potential existed, like why it was functioning. And it wasn't until I think I went to a Think Wrong 3-hour introductory course. I think that Mike Byrne was there, and
Christopher O'Keefe probably, and Jen Savada.
Jen Savada was the one who kind of pulled me into that. And the thing that really struck me about the power of it was that it was rooted in kind of in cognitive science. Is that it was at its heart, it was about how human beings have to navigate these things, not just like how organizations or teams have to navigate these things. Like it really, and you can see it in the book that I think you and Mike and whoever, I can't remember who else was
John
an author on
Bielenberg.
that. Oh yeah. Released called Think Wrong. It really kind of describes why we're so bad at this. It's a really important piece to me, and why, and some people don't really spend enough time on it. We have to really acknowledge our limitations in this space, both from a cognitive individual level, like why are we bad at thinking divergently? Why are we bad at incorporating new mindsets or seeing things from different perspectives? And then also the social barriers, and like why are we bad at doing this collectively in a small group? So that was like a huge breakthrough for me, and why I was so excited to eventually go through the public course, which I would highly recommend for anybody. It's a mainstay. All of those exercises are we're constantly pulling and stealing from the stuff we learned for stuff we run with Agitare.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. I think there's a distinction there that you make to both the cognitive science, so what's going on with our brain, as well as you alluded to it, which is the social science, which is how we behave as human beings and interact with each other as groups of people. And so we talk about that biological issue of the way that our brain works and the synaptic connections getting forged, and how that actually traps us into sort of predictable problem solving approaches as well as predictable answer sets, and then culturally how we behave and in terms of what we acknowledge as being normal or abnormal, and how we react to things that are abnormal. It's a healthy thing, I think, for a culture to protect itself from something that's a threat.
Mm-hmm.
But it also can be quite limiting, and it can ultimately lead to the demise of the culture if it's not open and receptive to new ideas, new approaches, new ways of doing things. And I'm sure that resonates for you, both in terms of a human being with a brain, but also somebody who works in a very distinct culture, right? That
Yes.
has norms that are extraordinary, and I mean that in like extraordinary, right? They work really well on behalf of the culture, but they also preclude certain things happening, which is also part of why I love the fact that you chose Agitare as the name for your for your community, because it's like we're going to be a little burr under the saddle of normalcy, right? We're going to just agitate it and agitate it and agitate it and see what change can happen.
Yeah. So I mean, and a lot of what I have been exploring recently is this idea of making a distinction between what is an engineered system and what's an organic system. Because what you're talking about are cultural systems, which are intended to be engineered, which kind of limits their ability to be organic, which is what they should be. Like human systems want to be organic. They want to change and evolve and constantly, like iterate and but we're trying, like we impose all of these rules to keep them well formed and kind of I want to say tailorist in their approach.
Right.
We tend to bring a factory mindset to what is really not a factory problem.
Right.
And that's where a lot of our problems come from is
we can blame a lot on Taylor.
Oh yeah.
The scientific measurement of business processes. It's like it just persists everywhere because it gives you this false sense of security that if we can measure it, it can be managed. It's like, not everything can be measured that way. I mean, Mike likes to use this example of if I take a kitten and cut it in half, well, aside from having a mess, it's no longer a kitten. It's the thing that I've taken it apart. I've dissected it, and I could say there's these two halves of a kitten. It's like, but that's of no use to anybody. Like, you can only understand the thing when it's in its whole form and you're experiencing it in that holistic way. While I'm all for the measurement of certain things, I also think that it leads us into a lot of traps. There, it sets up that, like I said, it's that false comfort that you get from believing that you precisely understand something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I do like the distinction of, like, I'm a big fan of the complexity science as relates to what we're talking about here, and I like the distinction between complicated and complex systems, being that a complicated system can be taken apart and understood. All the interactions can be mapped out and then put right back together. And it's the same motorcycle, right?
Right.
But complex, I've been kind of thinking about it in terms of a motorcycle race. You've got a bunch of riders on a racetrack, and they're interacting with each other in these very nuanced kinds of ways. You can't take a motorcycle race apart and put it back together. It is kind of, there are too many distinct interactions between all of these agents. And I've been trying to come up with ways of describing how then you make decisions. And this is related to the Cynefin framework, right? I think I talked to you about the other day. In a motorcycle, you look at all the pieces and you're like, oh, I diagnose a problem, and then I just have to get all the pieces back to functioning, and then it'll be a functioning motorcycle again. But the way that you make decisions with regards to a motorcycle race are, you're a rider in the race, and you kind of have to feel the road underneath you, and you have to feel how the tires feel as you're taking the turn, and you have to make these subtle exchanges with the other riders and look at how's the weather right now, and what even are the temperature of my tires right now, because that affects everything. There's no simple calculation for we could just take it apart and put it right back together again.
Right, you've got psychology and physics on top of all of that, right? So, so I think that's a really nice distinction. It's funny, we've been doing some work with an organization around problem finding, and then doing some we call it pain sizer. So how do you actually identify the problem and then the pains that are associated with that problem? And then you start to size those. And there's some things that we look at. Basically, one, how many people are experiencing the problem? So that's prevalence, right? So you size that, and we just do a T-shirt size. Is it a medium, large, medium, or small, right? So we're looking at prevalence. We look at severity. How severe is the pain? Like how acutely are they feeling? Is it medium, small, medium, or large on that one as well? We look at the consequence. So what's the cost of this problem? And you can measure that cost in a lot of different ways. It could be financial, but it could be psychological. It could be, it could be something intrinsic in terms of the way that it makes somebody feel about themselves, or it could be number of lives saved, or number of people, who are not going to be exploited, or there's lots of ways to talk about the consequence. And then we actually look at we size the complexity. So I really like that distinction there in terms of complicated versus complexity, complicated versus complex. Some of these, the bigger the problem, the more people are affected, the more complex it is. There's the sort of the unknown factors that are influencing the outcomes are really sort of the fascinating space there.
Yeah. So there's so I'm working on this presentation for the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum gathering, which is happening next month. And I've been trying to just come up with ways of describing why it's necessary to do these really deep kind of divergent exercises, because it's meant to be just an introduction to how and why we play games of discovery. And I had this, I'm kind of building this slow series of exercises, which are all around, you got a bunch of animals and you're organizing them into different rooms, right?
Right.
I think I introduced this to you.
Yeah.
And one thing that occurred to me as I was thinking, like, okay, so what if we get to this point of complexity where we're like, we have a purpose for why we're organizing them. Let's say it's an animal rescue. So now we have a purpose. We can determine which interactions, like which behavioral psychographic tendencies in the animals are most important when we know the purpose for what we're designing. And then I was thinking, like, what are the other things you might organize for animals? And one of them was, oh, we're going to store live animals for slaughter. And this is like an equal opposite to, you got an animal shelter. We want to keep them comfortable and safe, right? We want to know how the animals are doing, what their psychological state is. These are important centers of gravity for us, right? But in the animal slaughter scenario, I started to think about it, and I'm like, well, you want the quantity and the quality of their meat to be good, right? Those are considerations. And then I started to think downstream a little bit. I'm designing a storage space for animals while they're alive to be slaughtered. When is the value created in that scenario?
Right.
Well, it's created way downstream. It's actually created when people are purchasing meat to eat it. And it's not when in the animal shelter, value is created when you're taking care of the animal, because that's like the user. But when I'm storing animals for meat, the value is created by consumers, which means that the psychographic attributes of people buying that meat months later factors in to this problem, which means that it's like this added layer of complexity. When you were talking about the prevalence and the size and the complexity of a problem, I was thinking, well, oftentimes we think this problem matters because of how it affects the business, and people often don't think, well, how much does this affect the psychological state of your employees, and what's that going to do to how they feel about you, right?
Well,
I was thinking, like,
Temple Grandin would argue that the psychological state of the animal in the slaughterhouse matters as well. Right.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And it actually, there's, it's been proven out that the productivity of that meat supply chain, where you have animals that are feel secure and cared for, as you line them up for slaughter,
Yeah.
it actually increases, right? The fact that you don't have animals that are in a state of distress or anxiety
Yeah. Yeah.
actually facilitates that. So you can add that
Yeah.
level into it as well,
So
right?
this is why I brought that up, is because what I realized was, if you start to think about the psychographic characteristics of the people purchasing
Right.
downstream,
Yeah.
the I know that for one, I pay a lot of money for like cruelty-free meat.
Right.
That's something that's a choice that I make. Like, mostly like, I'm largely vegetarian, to be honest, but, if I see that somebody's sourcing their meat cruelty-free, I'm like, "Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
pay extra for that."
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because that matters to me as a consumer. So, our tendency to try and boil things down to this, like, factory mindset, to this, what
Yeah.
matters right now is within this really limited scope. We
Right.
don't we don't think broadly enough, and a lot of companies really suffer as a result of this, especially these days. There's more and more people are making their purchasing choices based on how they feel, like your ethical position as a corporation,
Right.
or whether they're contributing to the bad treatment of animals, for example. And one thing that I like about this, no, think more in terms of complexity, like, think in terms of the larger system.
Yeah.
Who else is a stakeholder here? Well,
Yeah.
somebody who cares about whether you treated animals with, kindness or cruelty. They're involved in your decisions about how, or they should be
Yeah.
involved in your decisions.
Well, I think we can certainly look at contemporary issues right now, and you could look at the racial justice,
Yeah.
issues that we're dealing with in Black Lives Matter, and the
Hmm.
idea of white supremacy, and a system that provides extraordinary privilege to one category of person and not others. Um,
Yeah.
and you can sort of say that's the outcome of a system that was very blindered, and not being empathetic, and not thinking about how everybody in society was experiencing this, and not
Yes.
equally valuing everybody in society. So you're right. You can just see this play out time and time again. Um,
Yeah.
I think this is one of the distinctions that we make in terms of talking about user-centered design, and design thinking, which is really rooted in this idea of being user-centered design, and think wrong and this is why I talk about them as being cousins, is we tend to look not just at the user, but we tend to look at the players in the ecosystem. So if you think
Hmm.
about who all is in this problem space, if you think about that as a painscape of a landscape of pain, that in this space there are lots of different parties. They are interconnected. They have different relationships, and some people are passing pain on. Okay, I'm going to get rid of my pain by giving it to somebody else.
Yep. Yeah.
And some people are working to lower the pain altogether.
Yeah.
But you want to start to look at the incentives and motives for everybody who's connected in this problem space,
Yeah.
and you want to look at the problem from those different perspectives. We're working with an organization right now, and it's really amazing how challenging that is for them not to just look at the problem from their perspective, but to
Hmm.
say, let's look at it not just from your perspective, and not just from the buyer's perspective, but let's look at it from the 4 or 5 other parties who are crucial to
Yeah.
the ultimate creation of delivery of your services, or delivery of your goods, and the creation of value, however we're going to define that. Let's look
Yeah.
at it from that, and let's start to understand what are the gives and gets. What are the things that each person is expected to give, and what they will get from doing that, and what does
Yeah.
that look like? We end up doing these a matrix is like one of those mileage things where you say, what's the distance between, in the old maps, I don't know, you're too young for there used to be something called the Thomas Guide. It came it was comb bound. It was a book full of maps, right? And
Yeah.
it would help
Absolutely.
you navigate around the place like Los Angeles. And you could look in there and you could see, how far is it from Barstow to Palm
Yeah.
Springs? And then you could say, how far is it from Barstow to San Diego? How far is
Yeah.
so we actually have these intersecting gives and gets for all the parties on the x-axis and the y-axis, and you're looking at,
Mm.
and so it would start with you. You'd be up in
Yeah.
the upper right-hand corner and say, what is Daniel giving to Daniel,
Yeah.
and what is Daniel getting from Daniel? right?
Yeah.
And then it would say, what is Daniel giving to Greg, and what is Greg, giving to
Yeah.
Daniel, and what are we getting from each other? And so you
Yeah.
start to look at these complex intersections, and the gives and gets isn't just functional. It's not just what are we getting? Like, oh, you give me some money and I give you some knowledge or a tool, right? It's
Yeah.
emotionally, what am I getting from you and what are you getting from me? And then from a self-image standpoint, what is the fact that I have a relationship with you say about me? And what
Yeah.
does it say about you? And what does it say? And what does it signal to other people?
Hmm.
This is
Yeah.
always an interesting thing about the Think Wrong intensive, where we have this mix, especially the public classes, where we have a mix of military and civilian,
Hmm.
and because there are these perceptions that people have of people in the military, and there's a
Yeah.
perception that people in the military have of folks who are civilians, right?
Yep.
And suddenly it's like, oh, wait a minute, I I get this self-image disbenefit that thought I would have associating with this person, and actually turns out that there's a real benefit to me, because
Yeah.
there's this human being that's got all of these experiences, and we have a lot of overlap that's quite similar, but then they've got some really unique experiences that are really beneficial to me, right? There's
Yeah.
some mindsets and attitudes and experiences and knowledge that they're bringing that are really, I'm missing out on by not having a
Yeah.
relationship with this person. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's brilliant, and I was just thinking I need to use that, for a project I'm working on right now, 'cause, a friend and I are we're working on a written, piece. We're co-writing something about the phenomenon of the frozen middle, right?
Yep.
Which is something that happens in every organization, because there are these people who are like, "Well, I'm trying to affect change, in this place, like below me, and somebody below me is getting in my way." So there's this frustration from the top, and then
Right.
there's people from the bottom who are like, "That guy said I could do this, but somebody below him said I couldn't do this,"
Right.
and there's this frustration from them as well. And what a friend kind of pointed out that I thought was brilliant and made me say we have to write a piece on this was, who has really explored the experience that those people in the middle are having, and
Mm,
why they're motivated to
mm,
behave the way that they are,
mm.
because they're not just like they're not just terrible people. Generally speaking, that assumption is
Yeah.
wrong, like
Yep.
that somebody's just bad.
Yep.
But that is I don't know if you've read the Phoenix Project, about about it's a novel about DevOps,
Mm,
and it's a lot of fun. But one of the things that I liked about it is there's this character in it who is he's the compliance guy. Like he's worried about being compliant with security,
yep.
and not like not releasing PII to the public and stuff like that. And everybody views him as the enemy,
Right.
and they all treat him like the enemy. And he
Right.
has this rough emotional arc through the story, where he at a certain point in the story, it seems like he's like about to kill himself,
Mm,
and the interactions with all the characters in him, and I thought that was really interesting and empathetic, to
yep.
be like, no, that's a person with
Yep.
feelings and reasons for the way that they're behaving. Why don't we think about our relationship with them? What we're giving to them, are we giving them a reason to work
Right.
with us? Are we
Right.
bringing them along with
Yep.
us? Those are the main questions that book asks, but it's
Yeah.
kind of what you just described reminds me a lot of that.
That character is, in the roles that we talk about, that's the sheriff, right? So we talk about
Yeah,
the sheriff, and the sheriff's got, there's a set of laws. I'm here to enforce the laws. Um, the outlaws don't like sheriffs, and they actually think that
yeah,
sheriffs are conspiring against them. And the problem there is just that there aren't is that the organization hasn't developed the right set of laws for
mhm,
the outlaws, right? To say the kind of work that you're doing, this disruptive work that's inventing the future, actually should be governed by a different set of laws than
yeah,
the part of the organization that's running our as is state, our current state, right?
yeah,
That needs to be regulated in a different way, because it shouldn't be experimental. It shouldn't be disruptive. It shouldn't be full of risk. We need the predictability here. But in this other part that's inventing the next thing that will at some point get to a stable state and be predictable, we need to be open to trying new things. We need to be open to experimenting. If the sheriff, if the compliance person knew, hey, there's a set of laws that for this kind of work, the predictable path work that we talk about, we're going to govern it this way. And for this bold path stuff that's inventing what's next, we're going to govern it this way. They'd be happy. So there's that aspect. And then there's the other thing of simply changing the question from, which is the problem that most people, the trap they fall into when they talk to folks, regulators and compliance people, lawyers, is, can I do this? Well, the answer to that question is always no.
Yeah.
Because their job is to say no, right? And this goes for managers as well. If you just look at the sort of middle layer, if you think about executives or officers or leaders and managers, I don't know the vernacular exactly to say what rank would be the manager class, and then the practitioners, right? The grunts, people doing doing all the hard work. That managers are seen as always saying no. Well, their job is to protect the organization from risk, right? Their job is to, in fact, minimize variance. And if instead of saying, can I do this, you said, how might I do this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Then suddenly you've invited them to be a strategic partner and said, there's this problem that needs to be solved. Let's ignore whether it's permissible or not right now. If it were, how might we actually do it? And then you suddenly invited them. You could invite the lawyer or the compliance person or the regulator or the manager to say, oh, interesting. So, if we were going to do it, I'm not saying we're gonna, but if we were going to do it, how might we actually do that? And you've just invited them to generate some new possibilities with you and to be this partner in solving, as opposed to, showing up and asking them to do their job, which is, okay, I understand you're the cop, right?
Yeah.
Can I do this illegal thing? No. Okay. Well, I guess I got to go talk to my congressperson to change the law.
Yeah.
So I can do this.
This is, and that's exactly, I've had issues with with the Air Force model of innovation for a while, where it seems like there are these places where there's no rules, and then there's where the rest of us live, right? It's and that's really frustrating for people who are driven to innovate their world that they occupy.
I'm going to mute the UPS man just showed up, so I'll mute on my side.
Yeah, and so as somebody who occupied that space and who was not like given that elevated status, or wasn't given those special permissions, or didn't have a strategic champion who was sheltering me for a majority of my career, I felt a great deal of frustration, and it made me just want to leave. Like, oh, you don't welcome my way of thinking in this environment, and you don't want to change things at the lowest level. You just want to run labs where your top priorities get innovated on. And that was really frustrating for me. And I kind of, I agitated on that subject for a number of years. And so now I'm, my primary purpose is, how do we make that, that kind of, sounds like what you're referring to sounds familiar from the Safi Bakal's loon shots. He talks about dynamic equilibrium. And I personally, I think that you would view it a little differently than Bakal put it, because what he was describing, I think he was trying to make his view differentiated a little bit from the culture first folks, because he talked about structure first, and he was like, culture is derived from structure, and that really hurt my brain a little bit, because I'm like, you're trying to reduce the idea of culture to a complicated system, and culture is not a complicated system. It's a complex system. Which means you can't just set conditions and culture will be great.
No, that's, you're absolutely right, because of that complexity. The culture is the intersection and manifestation and experience of so many things, right? That are whether it's inherited belief systems, whether it's the tool sets we use, or the language, or the geographic place that we find ourselves in, or the foods that we eat, or the songs that we sing, or there's so many pieces to that sort of just stripping it down to what are the structural,
and he wanted to say it was all about incentive structures. He said, there's like the political motivations, and those are, if you make it if you make it more important for people, you know, if you reward people politically for maintaining the status quo, then that's what your culture will be, which I generally agree with. But I think
Mhm.
that he put it in kind of overly simplistic terms for me, at what I saw people taking away from it.
Yeah, I think that incentives are have a really influential role
Yeah.
in what culture emerges. I mean, um, we have a client who is um, what they get paid for is a transaction that happens at a moment in time.
Hmm.
Uh, that has to do with standardized testing. So
Hmm.
you take the test, they get they get a payment.
Yeah.
Um, and so they're really curious. They really monitor how many people take the test and how much are they making. Um,
Hmm.
they talk about a desire to actually influence outcomes. They want to have people be based on the study to be more ready for something in their
Yeah.
whether it's to get to an advanced higher level of education or to be career ready, but
Yeah.
they don't measure how people are doing in terms of, are they actually getting to higher levels of study or are they career ready,
Yeah.
right? And there's a really easy way to measure if somebody's career ready. Are they getting hired, right?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to, if that was truly what was driving you, you would measure that, and you
Hmm.
would see that that the behavior of the organization, the things it prioritizes, would shift to what are the things that are going to actually get more people career ready and employed in a job where they're highly valued and they're doing what they want to do, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to at this moment in time they took this test,
Yeah.
and so it'll have a real influence in the culture, but that alone
Yeah.
isn't sufficient, right? That alone will you could not look at that and say, okay, we can tell you what the culture is now of the
Yeah. Yeah.
organization,
Exactly.
because
Yeah.
the leader of the organization has a huge influence. The city that they're located in has a huge influence. The 7,000 members of the organization have
Yeah.
that actually fund it have a huge influence. Broader cultural attitudes about education and job and employment, uh,
Yeah.
all of those things factor in. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. That's really interesting. One of the things that this comes back to, and you've alluded to it a couple of times, and I think part of what I'm sorry,
No, that's okay.
hang on, very persistent UPS man triggering my dog.
Very driven. Yeah.
It's like, okay. Um, Sorry about that. So what I was saying is, one of the things that I don't think that I think this is embodied in Think Wrong, but I don't think it's unique to Think Wrong, but it's probably just part of what we've always tried to do, which is, at the end of the day, let's net this out to, okay, you're a human being and I'm a human being,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And let's let's acknowledge that about each other. Let's connect with what it means to be human,
Hmm.
uh, and let's not lose sight of that. So when it's easy my as a designer, I spent a number of years doing user interface design and very immersed in human-centered design from a computer system standpoint. But even that's insufficient because it doesn't take into consideration, it historically had not taken into consideration the emotional context of what people were
Hmm.
experiencing. It was a very
Yeah.
rational kind of engineered thing, right?
Yeah.
It didn't take into consideration this idea of what I talk about as self-image benefit, what it means to be part of a community, what it means to be in a peer set, and
Yeah.
how that changes things. And so like what does it mean for me to be a human being engaging with you? What does it mean for us to be sharing in this conversation, to be sharing ideas? What does it mean at the end of the day? How are how are these frameworks and how are these tools and how is this language and how are these techniques of value to you in
Mm.
in the existence that you're trying to create for yourself and others, right? And the
Yeah.
difference that you're trying to make in the world. And so that's probably a little bit of my, being born in Berkeley and growing up in California kind of thing. And growing up in the middle of the redwoods like you did,
Yeah.
the sort of hippie vibe still
Yep.
right in
Yep.
there, which is, you know, we can't lose sight of that, and user centered. I'd rather be user connected, right?
Yeah.
I'd rather be human connected, people connected, and sort of understand, no matter how complex the problem, no matter how much the pain, that we're all experiencing the things like that in different
Hmm.
ways, and trying to stay cognizant of that in the work that we do. So there's that piece that sort of goes through the work as well. That's
Yeah.
in the approach that we try to take. It's why we use the like kind of language we use. We try to use
Yeah.
some of it's, we're trying to have a little bit of fun. We're trying to be human. We're trying to be accessible. Some of it
Yeah.
becomes a little opaque because of that, but it's like, that's all right. We can have a conversation. I can explain what it is.
Yeah.
It's why I don't use name tags. When we used to be able to show up in person in rooms, it was like, we
Hmm.
don't put name tags on. Well, why? Because I actually want to learn your name,
Hmm.
right? And I
Yeah.
want to be able to say to you, I really like what we're talking about. I can't remember your name. Can you just
Yeah.
tell me your name again? And it's like, it's okay to do that. It's like a little thing, but
Yeah.
it's just like, let's connect as people in
Yeah.
that way.
So there's something you're referring to, which is really like resonates strongly with something that came up today for me, where we were meeting with our Agitare leadership team. We've been having these weekly sync meetings where we talk about where we're at with the different lines of effort, whether we're still aligned to our original purpose,
Yep.
and we have this conversation. It's a very small team of dedicated people who are doing this for no pay, so it's always a lot of fun. And so and one thing that came up was this idea of an onboarding system.
Mm,
And I thought he was talking about an onboarding system for like the leadership team, and I immediately was like, I don't want anybody to interact with just a system in order to join us,
right.
because that comes at a price. When you try it's this theory again of treating a complex system like a complicated one.
Yeah.
You overly apply constraints.
Right.
You are like, here is a form that I want you to fill out with all of these data points, and those are going to inform how you onboard to the community. And my instinct was, this is supposed to be a community, which means that it's human based. It is entirely about the experience of humans, that humans are having with one another. We are all motorcycles on the road, kind of feeling where we're at with each other, and we're
Mm,
interacting in that way. We're not interacting as though we were, like, here's your specific lane that you have to be in, and you have to
right.
navigate it very, very accurately. Um, and what it occurred to me that, at least with the small community, a majority of the experiences I want people to have as they join us, I want them to be human experiences. I
Yeah.
want them to be conversations,
Yeah.
which is, it sounds a lot like what you're referring to, which is like, what are your touch points for this, right? And in design terms,
Yeah.
and how many of them are human touch points that can be adapted, that can see how you're doing with the experience,
Yeah.
that can just kind of meet you where you're at in the moment you're interacting with them.
Yeah.
Because a majority of systems that you set up in advance of that, um, won't be able to adapt in that same way if you pre-built it too rigorously.
Yeah. 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 It reminds me, we do some of these flow drills that are about, people think of them as icebreakers, but they're not icebreakers. They're actually that moment of human connection, that before we
Mhm.
get started, let's actually connect as human beings on this thing. So that I'm going to introduce myself with my first name. I'm not going to
Yeah.
tell you my title. I'm not going to tell you my rank. I'm not going to tell you my LinkedIn bio. I'm just going to say, first name and secret talent, or first name
Yeah.
and, strangest job, or first name. And, so I'm telling you something about myself that allows us to connect. And as people who, we
Yeah.
have as human beings, a lot of our life journeys are similar. I mean, we're born, we go to school, we go on to some form of work, we either have relationships or not, we have kids or not, we grow, we take care of our parents, we grow old, we die, right? There's this,
Yeah.
there's a lot of overlap in our
Sure.
life journeys. So there are all these moments where we actually have opportunities to relate and to connect. And those sort of finding those places of oh yeah, I did a weird thing, or I didn't know that about you, or
Yeah.
even what kind of tool are you, is this sort of, how do people perceive the value that they bring, that they, when they show up, how do they think about themselves, how do they think the value is,
Yeah.
think of themselves in terms of the value they create in the room. These are things that are I think really useful to know about each other, and to sort of start from that place. So
Yeah.
before we get going, Stephen Burke, who is one of the founders of a company in the UK called Leap, that does, it's interesting. It's a mix, sort of like what John McCaskill's doing. It's this mix of leadership development and mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
And he has a really simple drill, which we use all the time, and it works really well in the virtual, even if you have 40 people on your screen. It's just like one word that just share with us one word that describes how you're feeling right now.
Yeah.
Like, before we get started, and just like people to go through, I'm excited, I'm tired, I'm agitated. It's like, then something. Oh, we're all feeling these things right now, right before we get going, and we need to be mindful of that. My wife teaches second grade. She does the same thing with her second
Yeah.
graders. It's like it's like, oh, it's okay to do with second graders, but adults don't do that kind of thing. It's like, adults should maybe do a little bit more of that kind of thing. Maybe we'd actually be a little bit more compassionate with each other
Yeah.
than we did.
Yeah, absolutely. And that idea of that's a we did that during Summer of Design. I just
Yeah,
recently went through the Darden's Summer of Design, and for that was a lot of times the kind of introductory thing. It was how are you feeling right now? There's
yeah,
some self-reflection, and those reflective practices, especially like um, you know, it scales out to who are we right now? Like,
yeah.
there's who am I right now? Because I'm always somebody different, right? I'm
Right.
like, I am angry, hungry,
Right.
upset Daniel. I am excited, nervous Daniel. I'm
Yeah,
always kind of flowing between these states.
yeah,
Um, and one thing that they did at the in the Darden program that one of the facilitators did that I really appreciated was he asked everybody to draw. I don't know if you've ever done draw a spiral. He just
mm,
says for 1 minute, I want you to draw as tight a spiral as possible on a piece of paper. And I was like, oh, this is a weird exercise. I'm like by myself. I was in my car at the time. I was sitting in my car. I'm drawing this spiral, and I realized, like, like 30 seconds into this, that I was going into kind of this very clear-headed meditative state,
mm,
just because the physical practice of drawing a tight spiral and focusing only on that
nice.
tiny movement,
Yeah,
and you're just like breathing and drawing a
yeah.
spiral, and it's this weird trick.
Right.
And then I had a lot to say about how I am right now, because I had
Yeah.
cleared my head of all this other
Mm.
stuff.
Oh, that's nice. That's
um,
really nice.
yeah, yeah, it
Yeah,
was a really cool exercise.
I
I
like that.
have intended to use
Y-
in the future.
I will take that one as well.
Yeah.
Um, the Mike has coined this term. It's really interesting. In some of the work that we're doing, what we want to do is say, all right, we have an idea, we have a solution that we're working on. What are the biggest or most critical assumptions that actually, if we're wrong about the assumption, it's
Yeah.
it's not gonna work. So first of all, getting people to be able to make a distinction between a presumption, something that we're going to presume to be true, and we're not going to test it.
Yeah.
Like, AWS will be here next year.
Yeah.
Right? A year ago, it would have been safe for us to presume that you and I could get on a plane at any time and go anywhere we
Yeah.
wanted to, right? So that's an example of a presumption where things change dramatically and are no longer true. But presumption is
Yeah.
something we're going to just grant is true. We're not going to test it. An assumption, we believe this to be true, but we don't know for sure. We don't actually have the data to prove it. We haven't
Yeah.
gathered our own data, so we can't prove it. And then knowledge, and so we've been looking at these things that we know this thing to be true, right, about
Yeah.
this, and the more we looked at it, it's sort of like, it's interesting because what we can say we know to be true actually changes. And so Mike started talking about true for now. Right?
Yeah.
So it's true for, we're willing to say this, we know this, we're going to say it's true for now.
Yeah.
And as you were describing the different Daniels, it was like each one of those is true for now, right? So the hungry Daniel is true for now. That's who you are right now. The curious Daniel is the Daniel. The socially, reticent Daniel is another Dan. They're all true for now.
Yeah.
But they can change. And
Absolutely.
so this sort of being able to hold some of these things loosely, even what we presume to be knowledge, is really important in the work. Another nice exercise, thinking your spiral made me think about it, that Stephen Burke introduced to us. We bring him in sometimes to the Think Wrong sprints or blitzes, and we kind of sneak in some mindfulness or sneak in some leadership development, some team sort of stuff within the context of whatever the problem is. It's sort of like, well, sometimes with an organization, as much as we need to work on the problem, we actually need to work on the team.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So Stephen's really good to bring into that. Like a John McCaskill would be a great guy to bring into that kind of a situation where you might have a John Hawley expert facilitator, and a John McCaskill is going to like crack your head open and make you do something right, meaningful. So Stephen does this drill called perspectives. And so what you do, if you can do it in a room, we haven't created the virtual version, but we should be able to. You create this sort of sundial, create 8 segments, just a line intersected by another and then divided again. So you've got these 8 segments taped out. We use painter's tape. And at the center of that, you put the topic, the thing that you're working on. So let's just say, AI for weapon systems. We're going to put that in the center. Right. So that's the topic. And then each of these segments, it's a point of view. It's a perspective on AI for weapon systems. And you would sort of have some conversations, and you would figure out what those points of view are before you run the drill. And you just on an 8.5 by 11, you put all the different points of view down. So and then you leave one that's open. So it could be a new point of view. And you get the group to walk around the circle. And just and so you're walking around, you're looking at the thing in the middle, and you're looking at each of these perspectives, and you're just circling. And he actually it's like your spiral. So you're doing that a few times. So you get into this state. Physically, what you're doing is you're getting into a meditative state where I'm open and receptive. I'm looking at these different points of view. And he says first, okay, now you've cycled around, go stand in the wedge that represents your point of view best. And so you see this distribution of the group, and what you see is not everybody's in the same wedge. Interesting. So talk among yourselves as to why you went into that wedge. So they have that conversation. Okay, great. Now step back out, cycle around again. Now stop at the point of view that if not for your first point of view, this would be your point of view. So what's your sort of second position? So they do that. Now have the conversation as to why. Have that, and you can do some polling. You can ask people, why are you in that wedge, and they can share it with the group. So people are hearing that. Now cycle around again and stand at the wedge that is diametrically opposed to your point of view, that you actually don't believe in, you don't support, right? The one that you are most strongly against. And so now you're standing at that. Well, by this time, generally, you will see that other people you had at one time occupied that wedge that you're now occupying, right? And so you have why did you have the conversation about why did you occupy that wedge? Okay, so we have that. Now to talk among yourselves as to what is it that's true about that wedge that you're standing in. So what it does is get people to acknowledge that even though I don't agree with it, there's something true about it. Right. And so this whole exercise is about saying, look, for any challenge, there's lots of different perspectives, and there's reasons why those perspectives exist, and there's something true about every single one of them. Okay. And so to get out of this right or wrong.
Exactly.
Oh,
I'm just I'm finally reading Dave Gray's book Liminal Thinking right now,
Yeah.
which is like very much along those lines of thinking, right? It's
Yep.
like all of our beliefs are just beliefs. All of our
Right.
assumptions about the world are just that's just what we think right now. That
Right.
from our like I love how he describes the amount that our brains actually process of
Yeah.
even even never mind the fact that we haven't had an opportunity to see everything from every angle. Even the information that has been in front of us, we only know or have experienced a tiny fraction of the information that our eyes and our ears kind of took in.
Oh
We
yeah.
processed a minute fraction of that. And how did we process it? We put it through all these filters to translate it
Yeah.
into something that makes sense from our worldview. We
Right.
didn't like we didn't look at it objectively.
And
We're like,
then we created a
yeah.
PowerPoint deck just to make
Yeah.
sure it was as
Oh,
low
yeah.
resolution as it
Yeah,
could possibly
exactly.
be.
We we made sure that it matched the color scheme of our existing worldview
Right.
and
And
was the
is
right
it in the right
shape.
font?
Yeah. And it was like and we had a tiny, like, little box that was in a specific shape, so it had to fit that shape,
Right.
and that is what we experienced,
Yep.
and that's what we remember,
Right.
and that is just not enough to
Yeah.
capture all the information we need,
Yeah.
to make informed choices, especially informed choices for other people who are not us.
Right. Yes.
So,
Absolutely.
like normally I ask people to share their pictures at least in the first half of the conversation.
Okay. So
But
so let's
we're
start the
still
conversation
setting
now.
precedent here. Yeah. We're still setting precedent. I haven't done too many
Let,
of these. So,
so that's reminding me of thinking wrong. So let's go back to thinking wrong for a second, which is
yeah.
um, when we talked about the way that the brain works, when we talked about the neuroscience, and then that sort of social science, the way that cultural norms and the way that that tribes behave and groups of people behave,
Mhm.
um, those are actually, we've evolved to work that way. So that's, that is actually thinking right. Right.
Yeah.
It's not meant as a pejorative. That's when we're thinking right. It's quite wonderful that our brains work the way that they do. If we had to
Yeah.
relearn, sort of things every single day because the synaptic connections weren't holding,
Yeah.
that would be, it would be horrible. It'd be that Groundhog Day movie, right? In extreme. And if our cultures weren't capable of perpetuating themselves and protecting themselves, and then we we would lose a sense of identity and place and purpose.
Yeah.
So it's great that we work that way. That's the thinking right has its benefits, but it has its limitations. It inhibits, especially when we're trying to create what's next, when we're trying to create what's new. It inhibits us from doing that. So thinking wrong is actually about tricking both our brains and culture
Mhm.
into entertaining new possibilities,
Yeah.
and into exploring new possibilities and discovering what might actually work. That is outside of the normal. It is embracing that abnormal and being willing to explore that. So with that, we have done the abnormal for your podcasts, which is
Yes.
we
Of
didn't
course.
look we didn't look at the drawing at the beginning.
No, we didn't, and I'm okay with that, because we really we explored a lot of amazing topics so far, and I think that a lot of people are going to get just a huge amount out of what we've already covered. I am eager to see what you drew. You gave me, I think, a quick sneak preview
Yeah.
last time, but this is just to introduce as you pull that up. This is I asked Greg to share a visual representation of his relationship or interaction with or perspective on the field of design and facilitation, and it can be biographical or it can be just like a systems map or whatever
Hmm.
he wanted it to be. And this comes from my exploration of the use of visual thinking as a as like a starting point and a way for us to kind of create abstraction that allows us to go more deeply into the specifics of what, various things. So do you have your...
Yeah, I have it up. Let me share my screen here, and let's see if it's going to allow me to choose. All right, so you're seeing, it should be, it says you're presenting your screen now. Okay.
I can see it.
Okay, so so I was influenced by the sort of photo montage out of your the podcast that I watched.
Karen Hold's
Exactly, Karen's, yeah. And so I think I went down the autobiographical route with this, just because I thought that was kind of an interesting way to talk about the evolution of how did I end up here, and what are some things. And I sort of looked at early development. So this first, and we'll see how I can navigate this drawing. I'm zoomed in on it a little bit here, but when I was a kid, I always liked to draw, and I the earliest form of drawing, purple was my favorite color as a kid. So I managed to get a lot of purple pens. And I would sit, I think this was a meditation, so your spiral in the car again evoked that. Like I would sit with a piece of paper and I would draw these little loopy spirals, and they would kind of connect to each other. It was, now, I was born in 1963, so Paisley was a big, influence in my 60s, early childhood. I had Paisley shirts, right? So I might have been influenced by Jimi Hendrix and and purple and Paisley. But I would fill sheets of paper with these doodles, and then I would go beyond paper and start to doodle on walls and furniture and things like that, which did not endear me to my parents because I was doing it with permanent pens. But I always drew as a kid, and the sort of this drawing, as we kind of look at this, I grew up in the middle of the redwoods, so I shared earlier, you and I have that in common, of being at the bottom of 4 miles of dirt road, in the middle of the redwood forest. And the last house on the road, the nearest neighbor was actually my dad's ex-wife.
Wow.
She lived half a mile up the road, and my brother would sort of spend time with mom and then time with us. And so then the next neighbor was, yet another half mile. So we were pretty isolated. And so I would spend a lot of time listening to music, headphones on, listening to LPs and just drawing. And I always drew as a kid. I read a lot and I drew a lot. I also, the house that I grew up in was a little 1-bedroom house. It was part of a at the bottom of this road. It was on the other side of the gate to something called the Native Sons of the Golden West. They're an organization in California that have it's some kind of club, and they had a lodge, and it was pretty much a blue collar organization. So tradespeople who built these little houses out in the middle of the redwoods, and they would come up on the weekends and stay there, and they would get together in the summer months at their lodge. We had one of these little houses that was very minimal as a home, and there were 4 kids, and so my mom and dad slept on the enclosed porch. 2 of us slept in the bedroom, and 2 of us slept in a camper on the driveway, right? So lots of drawing, lots of listening to music. The TV was connected to this rotor and an antenna that sat at the top of a redwood tree. So my dad climbed to the top of a tree, lopped off the top of the tree, put the aerial up there, and then ran the and a rotor on it. And then we had the control that would sit in, and it meant that there were about 3 channels that we could actually view if you turned this thing and had it rotate to a specific direction. So I always had this. My dad was an engineer at Stanford University. He worked at the Hansen Labs, and he was, he was trained as a machinist and apprenticed as a machinist, and eventually became an engineer. And so our house was full of all these little inventions. They're sort of solutions to the to where we lived in the minimal house that we lived in. We heated the house with a wood stove. My dad would nick a 55-gallon drum of waste alcohol from the lab. It was left over from a process, and he got permission from this lab to just like take the 55-gallon drum. So we actually heated our house with waste alcohol. There's a copper pipe running into the stove, and he had machined a burner, and you had a valve, and you just throw a match into the burner, and that actually heated the house. So I had this this kind of hacking sensibility. You didn't call it hacking at that point. That was Dad, just solving the problem. But he solved it by making things. Looking at this drawing, the other sort of hack there was that, as I mentioned, there are 4 of us kids, and we lived in the confines of this little house. At one point, my cousin came from Denmark to live with us for a year, and we didn't have anywhere to put him because all the available space was taken. It just so happened my dad had finished building this little A-frame chicken house across the road from our house, and it was, really, my dad was is even at 89 a very good engineer, and he had designed this very sound little 8-foot by 12-foot structure, and built it, out of 2x4s and plywood, and roofed it. And but the chickens hadn't moved in yet. It was a clean chicken coop, unoccupied chicken coop. So Ola, my cousin from Denmark, got to move into the chicken coop. But before he did, we carpeted it, and we put insulation in and paneling and a window. As he ended his year abroad living with us, my dad thought, well, that worked out pretty well. Prototype, built it, prototyped it, tested it on the cousin, and he's like, how can I get these other 3 kids out of the house? So we built 3 more of these. And all of these projects always involved us. It wasn't my dad working in the garage. It was, we were seen as labor. So like, we were going to be involved. We're going to be involved in the, casting the foundation, the piers for these things, doing the prefab, doing the assembly, doing the construction. So I grew up in this world where any problem could be sort of solved, but with a little imagination, a little resourcefulness. And that was, that was sort of very foundational for me. So you sort of think about, these moments. My mom was the very compassionate human. I think that where that stuff, that sort of need to stay connected to human beings comes from. My dad was the sort of practical problem solver who was always looking for, always tinkering. Even that enclosed porch that they slept on, they had a raised bed. He made this bed that was 4 foot high so that they could lie in bed and then look out the back windows. And he'd climb those redwoods, and he'd clear cut the branches so that when they were lying in bed, they could see the Pacific coast.
Oh, that's incredible.
And they could see the sunset. And then he had a little TV that was at the head of the bed. And so to be able to watch that when you're lying in bed, he had a little mirror like hanging from this, so everything was hacked. So each of these rooms had a phone in it. There's a little switchboard that my dad had made in the house. So in the morning, he would wake us up by calling us. He would just like rotate through. We had one phone line. If we wanted to make a phone call in the house, he would set the timer for 3 minutes. When it got to 3 minutes, he would hang up on you. But you could go to the switchboard and switch it to your room and talk for hours. He didn't care. He just didn't want to hear us because there was 4 kids. Like, he didn't want it in this tiny house. So we were constantly witnessing this sort of improv hack prototype, but a very methodical, engineered approach to it. So super influential in terms of where I learned about problem solving and a systems-based approach,
Yeah.
and really, I think this idea of rapid ingenuity, making use of existing resources and combining them and doing new things with them.
Yeah. Oh man, there's so much here, and I'm so glad you did this exercise because I think what you came up with is just brilliant and full of insight. One of the first things that stands out to me, well, it like is like I relate to a lot of this, having grown up in the redwoods. There's a
Yeah.
real sense of well, there's kind of a lawlessness to it, you know,
Yeah.
especially
There's a reason why people live out there.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's wild country. There's not a ton of like, you know, permit enforcement going on.
Right.
Um, and you know, outside of like major construction projects, because my dad owns a construction company in Santa Cruz County. So
Hmm.
he, you know, he's a home builder. So he's
Right.
also he has that engineering mindset. So I grew up in the same way in a place where things were just always growing, like
Yeah.
you were just always adapting and building, and there was this sense that as our needs kind of develop, because as human beings are we're constantly like continuing to discover new types of value that we could be gaining from our environment. um we build on, and
Right.
you know, we tear things down and we
Yeah.
rebuild new things
Yeah.
when the old things stop being important. um and so there was never this sense, you know, I'm realizing from my own experience, I have never had the sense that there's just a perfect thing that you build and then you never
Right.
need anything else.
Right.
I It's just it's always a work in progress.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons that I love, I always kind of insist on getting our own place and our own property whenever we are a place. Like in Hawaii, it's not an
Yeah.
option for us, but in Maryland, we ended up living an hour away from where I was working
Mm.
because I love having a yard and a place to, you know, we built a chicken coop, and I'll
Yep.
tell you, chicken coops aren't that different from houses. That
Nope.
they're largely the same.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, I love that, like, constant ability to constantly experiment, and
Yeah.
there's always something to be molding, and there's always new experiences to be shaping, with your hands. So just a ton of stuff here, and on a related note, the idea of creative confidence, which is
Hmm.
a big one. You know, there's that book by one of the founders of, the D School and IDEO, I believe.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Kelly. Yeah.
yeah, the 2 Kellys, I
One of
believe.
Tom or yeah, Tom or the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I recommend that book to a lot of people, and
Yeah.
also one of the things I love about Orbiting the Giant Hairball,
Mm.
is he talks a lot about the creative confidence that we
Yeah.
lose,
Oh yeah.
or that a lot of people lose as children,
Yeah.
you know,
I
moving
I
from a
can't read
space.
that passage without crying
Yeah,
in
it's
I mean, I read
yeah.
it out loud to groups a lot, and I can't
Mhm.
I have to stop and catch my
Uh,
breath because
yeah,
I feel it so painfully. Like, I see how we have systematically,
yeah,
um, discouraged people from, being creative, from
yeah,
expressing that side of them, and how our whole education and workplace, does that to people,
yeah,
and it's
absolutely.
painful to see that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most powerful things about that is when you take it from this is how we behave in our home and our, you know, in our environment that we
Yeah.
make for us. When you take that mindset and you move it into, but what if our workplace was like that?
Right.
It it is transformative. It is, you
Yeah.
know, it changes the whole game. Like, no, what if we don't have to be miserable at work?
Well, that you just hit on really the, um, sort of, for me, the core of how I ended up where I am. So this is the sort of starting place, with in this drawing. The I'll jump to the end and then I'll talk a little bit about the middle, which is, um, uh, at a point. So I went to art school. I went to art school to be, an illustrator because I really
Mhm.
love to draw. I love to paint, um, and I one of the great things about going to, an art school where your professors are actually professionals practicing the thing they're teaching you.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a kind of trade school, really.
Mhm.
You know, is that you also learn what you don't want to be. So I say illustrators are fine artists who are too like risk averse to actually be fine artists, right? So they love expressing themselves, they love working in this medium, but they also want to make a living. And so I'm going to be an illustrator. Almost to a person, my illustration faculty members were like unhappy and depressed. And part of that was because this thing that had really been gratifying to them in terms of this self-expression was being dictated to them how they were going to do it, what the parameters were, what was rejected, what was accepted. And they were forced in this place. So I actually switched into design because I felt like design allowed me to both be creative, but also do it in a slightly more rational way. It was like there's some kind of rule sets, like when it comes to human factors and things like that, where you can apply those and you can kind of reason your way to solutions, and you can bring people along with. It's not as subjective. In theory, it's not as subjective. In reality, a lot of design ends up being really subjective too.
Yeah.
But then I quickly evolved from a designer who worked at the drafting table, another artifact from another era, to somebody who was using design for strategy making purposes. It was like, let's think through how to solve this problem. Let's use the creative elements of design. Let's use those principles of design to solve these other kind of non-visual or non-traditional design problems. And so I was really intrigued by that. But when we started, and what partly motivated me to start Future, which became Solve Next, was what happened when I started working with people, applying some of these approaches with people and teaching people how to use them who don't see themselves as creative. Those people who've been told, by society that either they're not good enough, they're not creative enough, or that's just like weirdos do that. Like that's just like those are the freaks and geeks do the creative stuff, and you're not normal if you do that. So people try to conform to what's normal, which means I can't tell you that I'm an artist, right? From the orbiting the giant hairball, where people are no longer raising their hands saying, kids are no longer saying I'm an artist. So what was really gratifying was like what you could see the profound effect it would have on people when you unlocked their ability to be creative, when you unlocked their ability to solve problems in ways that felt kind of weird and maybe unusual for them, but then they saw the effect of it and what they could actually do. And it's like, that's super powerful. So to me, it was less interesting to get the problem and solve it myself than it was to help help a lot more people try to solve the problem with these techniques, with these approaches. And to think about if you're motivated at all by making a difference in the world, like what's the difference that you can make if you train 1,000 people how to do something versus if you try to do that thing yourself? Right.
And the barriers that you're like, a lot of times, in my experience, there's a lot of people who are just waiting for permission.
Right.
Absolutely. They're not like, it doesn't take a great feat to get them to suddenly become self-expressive. It like what you do with that can become a really challenging, and why facilitation requires a lot of skill and a lot of practice and a lot of different techniques, because what you do with that then can be a real thorny issue that requires planning and practice and iteration. But just that initial, there's for just an enormous number of people, there's like a dam waiting to be burst that doesn't take that much. It doesn't take that much. A lot of times it just takes making people feel safe and then giving them permission. And then there's all this stuff that they have not felt like they're allowed to express up until now. And that can be a hugely powerful and gratifying experience for people.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the so giving people permission. One of the drills that we run, the big yes, is sort of Djibouti, which you've done, anchored in the practice, the improv practice of yes and. Yes and is such a simple thing, but that's a form of giving permission, right? That says rather than no because, or yes but, or shutting people down. Yes and says, okay, we're going to give each other permission as a team, as a group, as a community. We're going to give each other permission to build on each other, and we're going to actually have an obligation. We're going to enter into this contract where part of our responsibility, just like it is in improv, is to make our cast members look better, right?
Yeah.
Like our job is I've got to, when I make a contribution, it's to make you look good, not to make me look good. And suddenly that just changes that sort of social dynamic and creates that kind of permission. And so we see all the time, it's a simple exercise, it's a simple principle, but it really is transformative for people to just like go, oh wow, if I just like can get out of this habit of yes butting people, and get into this habit of yes and. One of the other things that I think that helps people feel comfortable, and this is maybe that middle part where I showed you the drawings from the early stage of my career, and then talked about this sort of moment or realization that I had of, well, rather than being the designer working at the board, if I actually sort of change the context of the design problem and equip and enable other people, I can have a lot more impact. I can actually make a bigger difference. There's this other piece, which is this sort of discovery of the importance of simple mental models or frameworks. And so in terms of my evolution, you sort of see this background of where I came from, and this hacking culture, this creative culture, this environment like you talk about, where in the redwoods where kind of anything goes. We lived down the road from a commune where everybody built their own house right out of whatever was around, and the way that they fed themselves, and there's all these, it was countercultural, right? And so you had this sort of example of counterculture and some really amazing people doing great things. But I also sort of discovered that the importance, and this was in the phase of my career where I started doing user interface design, and where I started really for the first time working with multidisciplinary teams. So traditionally in the communication design world, you're dealing with other communicators and communications professionals, and you have your client, but it's a fairly insular sort of community of people doing that work. Within user interface design, whether it's for a hardware product or software product, if you're on a good team, you're dealing with a software engineer or a hardware engineer. You're dealing with cognitive psychologists. You're dealing with, a product manager of some sort. You're hopefully dealing with somebody who understands user testing and research. And so you've got this mix of skills and perspectives and ways of looking at the problem. And having a shared mental model, having a shared cognitive model that would say, okay, how are we going to organize our thinking and our action around this thing that we're trying to do, was really useful. So I worked for a guy named Aaron Marcus at a firm called Aaron Marcus and Associates, and he was a very early, he's a pioneer of graphical user interface design. And he had a very clear framework that we used to engage in talking to people about user interface design, from what is the overarching metaphor, like what is the cognitive model that organizes the functionality and the tasks and the roles, what's the navigation schema, and then what are the appearance characteristics. And so you kind of work through this structure, and I found, wow, it's so easy to sit down and work with a team when you have this simple framework. Whether it's absolutely right or absolutely wrong isn't what matters. It's that we've got this thing that we're working against. So I started doing work, these little drawings are just like simple ways of helping people think about things. So Tom Peters, in one of his books, writes about the importance of sort of the expectations that you create versus how you deliver against those expectations. So I sort of borrowed that and use this equation when helping my clients in the past working on brand, and say, so simple definition for everybody has different definitions of what brand is. And so I'd say, look, it's easy. Brand is how you're understood in the minds of the people who matter most to your success. So like, don't worry about the whole world. Think about the people who are going to be important to your success. How you're understood by them is that's what your brand is.
Yeah.
And so you have some control over that, but it's in somebody else's head,
Yeah.
right? So that's a complex system,
Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah.
um, so, but think about the things that influence how you're understood. One are the expectations you create. That's traditionally where people think about brand. Like that's marketing and sales and all these
Yeah.
things, right? The logo, the color, the type, the, you know, the elements of it. I'm going to create some expectations. Then the D is how we deliver against those expectations, right?
Yeah.
So what really shapes understanding is not just the expectation, but whether you live up to that expectation or not. So
Yeah.
if you tell your wife, don't worry, I'll take the trash out,
Hmm.
and you do it reliably, it's like, well, Daniel's a reliable guy.
Yeah.
If you say I'll take the trash out and you don't do it, then it's like
Hmm.
Daniel's a flaky guy.
Yeah.
Those are the understanding is you set an expectation, and then how did you actually deliver against that?
Yeah.
And that shapes the understanding. And it turns out that's true in all human relationships. Like, we have expectations of each other. That's that gives and gets things. What am I going to
Yeah.
get? What am I going to get? And
Yeah.
then how we deliver against it, that makes us decide whether or not, what's our opinion of this person. Our opinion is how we understand somebody. Um,
Yeah.
so this simple little device for people and thinking about, oh, there's this simple framework that we could actually organize all of our work against. Who in the organization is expectation setting? Who's responsible for delivering?
Hmm.
And are we keeping those things in sync, right?
Yeah.
Larry Ellison famously sets expectations for Oracle by doing vision selling. And so the question is, can the rest of the organization deliver what he's
Hmm.
selling?
Yeah.
Can they manage that gap between the vision that he's selling and what they can actually deliver? And when that gap gets too wide, then they lose credibility, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you can see how that plays out. So that device, the little drawing with the flip top head, was just thinking about, again, this is all from brand work that I used to do. Is thinking about, if you want to think about how you're interested, think about it that there's we all have, like, we flip our head open, we got little file tabs in there,
Hmm.
right? And so I've got like the people that I can count on, the people I don't
Yeah.
trust, the people who are brilliant, the people who are super creative, the people who are a pain in my ass, right?
Yeah.
So I've got all these file folders, and the question is, like, which file folder are you trying to occupy? Are you trying to create a new file folder, or are you just going into the
Yeah.
miscellaneous folder? you know, so just think about it. Like, everybody's got these file folders in their head. What are you trying to build, or which one are you trying to create? Another,
Yeah.
like, this little useful way for people to think about it. Oh, we're creating a file tab right now. Have we gone in the wrong folder? Have we gone in the right folder? Right?
Yeah. So I've been working on some sort of problem solving within an organization I'm in right now, and one of the canvases that I've found really useful comes from systems thinking. It's the iceberg model,
Mm-hmm.
and the iceberg model is very simple. It starts with what's the visible part of the
Yep.
iceberg. It's the things we can see people do. It's the
Right.
behaviors and practices. Well, beneath that are patterns of behavior. Like
Mm-hmm.
those have formed into some kind of pattern, and then beneath that are structures that result as a result of the patterns of
Mm,
behavior.
mm,
Right? There
yeah.
also beneath that are structures that we intentionally build. And then beneath that, at the very bottom, are mental models. So there's this relationship with there's always like as the iceberg grows or shrinks or changes, what's happening on the lowest level affects every other level. It's
Yep.
like our mental models cause us to create structures. Mental models cause us to have behaviors that create unintentional structures,
Right.
right? So
Right.
that's
Yeah.
just like something that I was thinking of is this idea of what's in our heads, like as
Mm-hmm.
individuals, and how does that relate to what we're trying to do here?
Yeah.
Because if we're not addressing the fact that we all have mental models, and the the differences, the problems that arise when we have
Yep.
differences in our mental models,
Yes.
we haven't intentionally, like, hey, everybody, here's a reminder. Here are our values. For example, this is the
Right.
simplest example.
Yeah.
Getting everybody aligned to a single set of values is something that a lot of organizations don't do.
Right.
Um, and as a result, it's just, oh, we don't have values. We have the systems, and and that's it. And then we
Right.
all have our own individual values. That doesn't
Right.
work at all.
No.
You know,
Yeah. Or they have, worse, they have stated values and they
Yeah.
have lived values, and the lived values are very different than the stated values. So
Yeah.
I would maybe um, reframe a little bit what you said is like we've got systems, we don't have values, we have systems, and we all have our individual values. Well, there's some emergent set of values that actually are lived in the organization.
Yeah.
They might not have been named or articulated, but
Yeah.
they are. I'll give you an example. I worked for a company that put itself up for sale, and we were actually got the good thing was it was a financial services company. The good thing was we got to pick the buyer.
Mm.
We were owned by Wells Fargo and Nico Securities, and we got to pick the buyer. One of the companies had a tradition of the executives who worked there would leave the shoe of a sexual conquest on their desk.
Mm.
Okay.
Mm.
As a kind of trophy.
Hmm.
Now, so you could say nowhere did somebody write a value down of what that value was, but
Yeah.
that reflected the value of a value in that
Absolutely. Yeah.
organization, right? And it actually was a signal as somebody selling an organization that we don't want to be part of that culture, right?
Yeah.
Because we learned about that.
Yeah.
Somebody thought it was funny, right, about their
Mhm.
culture. It's like, yeah, okay, that's a bad fit for us. So
Yeah.
those values are not always explicitly articulated, but they
Yeah.
exist, right? And they
Yeah.
haven't been named yet.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that's an important thing. Yeah, but I mean, your point is well taken, which is we've got our individual values, we've got these either explicit or implicit values,
Yeah.
and we don't have any opportunity to align. So the reason I'll stop sharing the picture, the reason I showed these, and this is another one around just how to organize our thinking and action around brand and how we're going to build it. Why do we
Yeah.
exist? What do we do? How do we do it? And there are these different sort of points of touch points actually that shaped how we understood the reason I bring it up is this sort of this other discovery, which was the power of a simple framework to
Mhm.
organize how we think and how we act. And I'd add maybe to that sort of how we converse, how we exchange or dialogue around something, which I think is part of the
Yeah.
action. So it's just like, how am I thinking about this thing and what are we going to do and how do we talk about it? Values are a really good example of it. I mean, you can even see this in our current political climate. If you just look at the, you know, there are few organizations that have more clearly stated and more clearly lived values than the branches of the military.
Yeah.
Right. And you can see in those military officers how their experience in the political realm has really graded against their values and how they've had to live they've continued to live their military values because in a political context which appears to be absent of them,
Yeah.
they can't say, oh, I have these values and now I've got this other value set that I'm going to replace it with, or
Mhm.
that will be will supersede it. It's I'm living these values. This is who I am. I'm doing it in this other context. And so
Yeah.
it's been really interesting to sort of listen to some of these generals and other leaders who come from cultures that are so true, right, in
Yeah.
terms of the way that they live their values, and just into kind of witness and hear from them what their experience has been like coming out the other side of it,
Yeah.
and how in a sense traumatic that is, I think,
Yeah.
to sort of realize that, hey, there's this whole part of the world that's that's living a whole bunch of unstated values that are actually quite
Yeah.
contradictory to what governs us kind of culturally.
I wrote a piece, I think the beginning of this year about the Air Force core values,
Hmm.
which I'm kind of reminded of because there's this one that's always irked me. It's this service before self. Um, and you talk about explicit versus implicit values. My experience of that was very much at odds with how people were describing it. People were
Mm,
like, "Oh no, that doesn't mean we don't, we don't also take people's needs as individuals into account, or we don't take care of people. That's not something that we enforce on others, because I like to say selflessness is a great value to have as an individual, but a criminal one to impose on other people.
yeah, right.
It Right, it means something
Yeah,
completely different when you're
right,
the enforcer
right.
of a value like that,
Yeah.
and that's what I saw it kind of being wielded as, which transforms it.
Hmm.
It's no longer like, "This is our shared value." It takes on this new meaning, which is
Yeah,
the explicit doesn't match the implicit,
right.
and,
Yeah,
and
it gets
I
perverted in that situation. It's a really good. It's a really. I remember that posting, and I think it was a really valuable insight to say there are certain values that you can't impose on others,
Yeah,
and when you do, you are actually perverting the value in a way that's
yeah,
actually that's really dangerous. Um,
yeah.
and there are some things that we have to choose for ourselves.
Yeah, I
Uh,
feel the same way about stoicism. Like having stoic values is great. Like I have internalized. I grew up in a deeply religious, household where
mhm.
asceticism was very, like suffering can bring you it can bring a lot of good to you. It can build
Mm,
character. It can having gone through difficult experiences can be a hugely beneficial for you
yeah,
psychologically and growth, but that doesn't mean you should you should be torturing people for their
for
benefit.
their benefit.
That's Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah,
Uh, so that's sort of an interesting,
yeah,
yeah, the explicit implicit values thing and being intentional about our values, but I think on a larger scale, and how this fits in with organizational design, how the values that we state and whether they match with who we are and who we want to be, and
right.
whether that aligns with the value that we're trying to bring into the world. One thing that I really see missing from a lot of those is, like I talked about early on, I talked about storing animals for slaughter.
Yeah,
That downstream of what you're doing, and in this case, upstream of the values to create something are the values to take care of the people within the organization,
right.
uh, which is a really important piece that I've been having a lot of conversations lately where they're like, "Oh, can you bring facilitators in to help us solve this problem?" And the first question that I'm having conversations, and they're like, "Yeah, we just want to create a process." And
Mm,
my first question, you talked about leadership
right.
building and sneaking that in there. My first question is always like, I I don't know if you're at a stage where you could have a process,
Right.
because you're not who you need to be to create and enforce and sustain that process.
Right.
Which
And have you answered your why, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but you get back to purpose, right? Or
Yeah.
the ultimate why is our purpose. Like, what is
Yeah.
our, and I don't mean, we're here to process X number of transactions. It's like, okay, well, why does that, it's the old five whys, right? Why does
Yeah.
processing transactions matter? Like when you get down to that sort of fundamental, this is why we do this, right?
Yeah.
Because, um, when we process transactions efficiently and honestly and with integrity, it improves the quality of these lives, in these ways. It's like, oh, so that's the sort of transformative purpose that you have in the world.
Yeah.
Now you get clear about your why. Now we can start to talk about process in terms of how you actually, um, what are the systems you can put in place, and what's the value you want to create with that purpose, where are there
Yeah.
opportunities to do that, and then what's the process for making that happen. um, the Again, the sort of simple models when I would introduce in the brand world, hey, this is how you want to be understood. Let's talk about how you want to be understood. And let's think about the expectations you create, how you want to deliver against that. The sort of simple set of questions, like, who are you? you know
Mhm.
uh, what do you do? How do you do it? Why does that matter? Like, these
Yeah.
are the four questions you have to answer. who are you who are
Yeah.
you what do you do? How do you do it? Why does that matter? And
Mhm.
who does it matter to? And
Yeah.
like, organizationally, you just need to be able to answer those. And then once you can answer those, then you can talk about, okay, so how do we start to shape those expectations, and how do we start to deliver that in a way that doesn't create these contradictions where we have, we said one thing, selfless, and then we did another, which was which is exploitation, of individuals by asking them to deny themselves. It's like, wow, okay, whoops. Either that, if that is the intent, then say it. Like, don't create the dissonance, right? It's like, well, we're building an army of selfless people, of individualist people.
Well, I've heard it. I've heard it expressed that, some people view that as the brand of the military. You're trying to, some people view that as the brand of basic training. You're trying to strip people of their identity so that you can rebuild them as warfighting machines. I've always rejected that because I'm never going to be a cog in a machine. I view my value as like as John Margolick expressed in a interview I did with him, he chaos muppet. He got from an article by Dahlia Lithwick. Like, there's chaos muppets and there's order muppets. I'm a chaos muppet. Which means that
animal or beaker.
Exactly. Yeah. So I kind of I think we all have like a unique value to bring, which comes very, you described your origin story there as a design superhero, and we all have that, and that we all have very unique kind of formulas to draw on, and that's a lot of what we're trying to do with design is take as full advantage of that as and use that to build good things as possible.
And I think that the important thing is you're talking to the Agitare. Am I saying it right?
Agitare, yeah.
Agitare.
Yeah.
As we talk to that community, and anytime I talk to people who are learning to be or improving on and building themselves as facilitators, it is to bring themselves to that, right? Is to find their own voice in terms of how they do that work. It's not to try to emulate somebody else, but to like there are lots of exercises and drills that that we'll all use. But when you can make a connection to a personal story, just as you asked me to do with the drawing, when you can speak to that with that kind of intimate connection and knowledge, we're going to do this thing, and I'm going to bring I'm going to connect to it in a personal way. When you can bring your own style of how I engage with and orchestrate and the interaction of people, when you can bring your own sort of your own values and what's important to you in terms of that human exchange and interaction, when you bring that, then you become a really effective facilitator, and you create really meaningful experiences for people. And I think that's important. I've said some people, I tend to, if I'm live in a room, I tend to be pretty loud. I tend to be pretty energetic. I like to put energy out and watch and get energy back. But some people are more soft-spoken, right? Some people are quiet. Some people are more reflective and internal processors. Like Stephen Burke, who I mentioned, Stephen is like the sweetest, most lovely human being you'd ever meet. And I don't think he's probably ever raised his voice in his life, right? He's just this soft-spoken Welshman who he's like the leader whisperer. He'll come in and he'll just like quietly transform people. And I would never expect Stephen to do what I do, and I would never and Stephen would never expect me to try to do what I would fail miserably at doing what he does. And so I just think it's really important for people as they're doing this kind of work, as they're learning these techniques, as they're building their toolkit out, also make sure that you bring yourself to it, right? And sort of say how do I want to show up, and how do I bring everything that I this accumulated over my life journey to this work, and make it that much more meaningful for people.
No, that's such an important point. Like, you know, a lot of this just you know, Agitare and my exploration of it really arose from my realization that there was no magic framework that you could just
Right.
plug in anywhere.
Right.
There's a lot that goes on in the human interaction portions of that, that takes, you know, it takes you feeling the road beneath your motorcycle.
Yep.
It's you're navigating a bunch of people at the same
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and that takes a bunch of, you know, kind of nuance and the
Hmm.
ability to read people and interact, you know, in the way that works best for you and your
Yeah.
personality. Because yeah,
Yeah.
and I love feeling, you know, I love being in facilitated sessions with different people and
Uh,
realizing that they do it completely different from me.
yeah.
And I'm like, well, that, yeah, that works for you. You know, like you created the value you needed to in that session in a way that I definitely would not have. And that's what we're trying to kind of empower in people with
Yeah.
Agitare.
Yeah, that's
This
one
has
of the fun
been,
things
yeah,
about that's one of the fun things about teaching is you see it's like, oh wow, that's a great story. I would have never done
yeah,
that. That's you know. So you're like always. It's fun to watch and it's fun to harvest and say, oh, I could use that. I could
yeah.
incorporate that. So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Hey, this has been just such an incredible conversation. I wanted to thank you again for joining me. It's always such a joy to spend time talking with you about this stuff.
yeah.
And just one last time, I'm going to encourage people to check out what you're doing with Solve Next. You're looking a lot at innovation strategy these days,
Yeah.
and that's super exciting work that I'm, you know, still working to tie you into people in the Air Force. We'll make it work
We'll
at
find a
some
way.
point.
We'll crack
Yeah,
that nut.
we will.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
will. You know, or I'll retire in, you know, in 5 years after trying, and we'll say we gave it the college try. But
yeah.
um, yeah, this has been fantastic. Is there anything you wanted to kind of impart that we didn't cover or we almost covered?
No, I think it's great. I admire you for doing this and for taking it on and just constantly pushing and you know making stuff.
Mhm,
You know, trying things. I think that these conversations are really important
mhm.
and can be really fruitful. So thanks for doing it. I do want to see you at some point pick that guitar up and play the theme song for the podcast.
Oh
I
yeah,
think that's going to be important. You know, you need to have a theme song. I know, you know, so you don't want to
yeah.
impose any structural thing on there, but I think that'll be important. You
Yeah, it'll
know,
be a new theme song every time.
yeah, absolutely. Why not? um, so no, but it's a joy to have the conversation with you and to learn from you and to you know have you keep me curious too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Greg. I
Okay.
gotta run off to lunch now.
Yeah,
And I am
you go have
sure,
lunch.
yeah, I'm sure we will talk again soon.
All right. Take care.
All right.
All right.
Bye.